Okay, yeah, so I'm going to tell you a bit about how, well, not so much the how, but what we found from evaluating the impact of minimum unit pricing in Scotland. So what is MEP in Scotland? MEP sets a minimum price below which alcohol cannot be sold in licensed premises in Scotland. It was implemented on the 1st of May 2018 at 50 pence per unit. It's both a population level and a targeted intervention, so it's population level in that it applies to the whole population because it is applied at the point of sale of alcohol, but it is targeted at specific products that are or were sold relatively cheaply compared to their strength. MEP is set in legislation, and that legislation includes two different clauses that are maybe a little bit unusual compared to some other laws. So it includes a sunset clause, and that requires that MEP will cease after 6 years if the Scottish Parliament do not vote to continue it. It also includes a review clause, which is very strongly linked to the sunset clause in that ministers are required to lay before Scottish Parliament a report that examines both the how MEP has operated, but also the effects of MEP on a range of different outcomes after 5 years of implementation. So to that end, the Scottish Government commissioned Public Health Scotland, or NHS Health Scotland as we were then, to conduct an independent evaluation of MEP that will help to inform the Scottish Parliament decision on whether it should continue. So within the evaluation, we asked two overarching questions. They were, to what extent has MEP in Scotland contributed to reducing alcohol-related health and social harms? And are some people and businesses more affected either positively or negatively than others? Because I'm covering a whole evaluation here that incorporates a whole range of different studies of different types, I am not going to go into a lot of detail about methods used and that kind of thing. But we did take a theory-based approach to the evaluation. That essentially means that we develop a theory of change, which is a plausible chain of events that would then lead to an overall outcome. That theory of change is evidence-based and informed by expert consultation. And this is what the theory of change for MEP looks like. I am going to focus primarily on the main findings across this main chain of events. So that is basically saying that assuming that MEP is complied with and that we show that it has been complied with, we should see changes in price, both at an overall level, but for certain types of products. That should then lead to reduced purchasing, reduced consumption, and hopefully safer patterns of drinking. And then ultimately, we should then see reduced health and social harms. I will touch on this area here, the purple, so that is looking at some of the sort of more unintended consequences of the policy. So the final report that we published earlier this year, back in June, it wasn't just based on the studies that were in the formal evaluation, which was led by PHS. We did a broad evidence synthesis or an evidence search and synthesized data and evidence from 40 studies covering those different outcome areas. We incorporated different types of evidence. So I think today it's been very heavily focused on very quantitative data, which is great. I love quantitative data. But we did also include qualitative data, and they have different purposes. So the quantitative data is providing us with that overall sort of population level impact, being able to identify where impact has happened and also quantify it as much as we can. Whereas the qualitative data is providing the kind of more lived experience, giving us understanding of some of the mechanisms that might underlie some of that quantitative data, and also maybe some insights into some of those unintended consequences. So, as I say, focusing on this main part of the pathway, if we start with compliance, we had quite a lot of data, quantitative and qualitative, contributing to this area. Overall, the message was that MEP was pretty well complied with by retailers. We had strong quantitative evidence that sales of alcohol below 50 pence largely disappeared, and we can see that here. So we've got Scotland on the left and England on the right. In each chart, we have a price distribution of alcohol in the year before MUP, which in this instance, in the red box, is the line that is furthest to the left. And we can see that a good sort of 50% or thereabouts of alcohol is being sold below 50 pence per unit prior to MUP, and then the line completely drops off and a vast quantity falls right on that 50 pence line. And in England, that didn't happen at all. The lines are virtually the same, both pre and post MUP. And we got that kind of same picture across a range of different data sources, so that was consistent. The qualitative evidence showed that retailers found the legislation relatively easy to follow. We did identify a few isolated instances of sales below 50 pence per unit, but they were generally identified as being sort of teething problems with introducing the policy, and they weren't typical of the overall picture. So in terms of price, we had a lot, again, a good amount of different quantitative and qualitative evidence, but strong quantitative evidence that there was an immediate and sustained increase in the average price per unit of alcohol, and depending on which source we looked at, that ranged from around about 3.5 pence per unit to around about 6 pence per unit. Again, we saw kind of consistency across a range of different data sources there. The average increase was driven by increases in price in certain products, so not unexpected that we would see the greatest increase being amongst certain types of ciders, perries, and own brand spirits. And those were the products that were typically sold below 50 pence per unit prior to MUP being implemented. The prices tend to be clustered around the 50 to 65 pence per unit range. So one theory that was discussed prior to MUP being implemented was how would it affect the rest of the distribution, and would everything just shift up the distribution curve? So prices that, products that were already sold above 50 pence per unit, would they also increase in price? That wasn't typically what we saw. So the blue line that is clearly got the big spike there at 50 pence per unit, that's the post-MUP Scotland line. All of the other lines, the blue lines are Scotland for pre-MUP or for England, the red lines being England. And you can see that the one that's massively out of kilter with everything else is the Scottish line after MUP was implemented. And then once we get up to 65 pence, the curve just goes back to exactly what the sort of pre-MUP trend was. So everything that was previously sold below 50 pence per unit just shifting into that kind of 50 to 65 pence bracket, with the majority being at 50 to 55 pence. So in terms of the qualitative evidence, it was pretty consistent with the quantitative. Retailers felt that they reported increased prices for certain product lines, particularly those high-strength, low-cost ciders and some own-label products. And some retailers reported very little change. That might largely depend on what type of products were stocked. In terms of the consumer, there was a bit of a mixed bag here. Awareness was, in terms of the policy or increase in price, depended on the type of drink consumed. And also, if they did notice a price change, it was most typically described as small and not always attributed to MUP either. So the next sort of section on this chain of events is then we would hopefully see a reduction in consumption and drinking patterns. So again, we have a good amount of strong quantitative evidence that there was a reduction in population level consumption as measured by retail sales at both 1 and 3 years post-implementation. So a 3% overall reduction that was driven entirely by sales through the off-trade. So there was no change to sales through the on-trade at all. So off-trade just being shops and supermarkets, on-trade being restaurants and pubs. Again, as we have seen with the price, we saw the greatest reductions were amongst things like the ciders, perries and spirits. But we did also see an increase in fortified wine sales, which is almost certainly down to the fact that fortified wine was typically priced around about the sort of 50 pence per unit level already and wasn't therefore impacted by the policy. So it's likely that we have seen some switching there from some types of products to fortified wines. In terms of, so the sales level, the sales data is only at a population level. We can't do any sort of subgroup analysis with that data, but we did look to studies that used household purchasing data. And we found that the greatest reductions were in those households that purchased the most prior to the policy being implemented. One study from the range of studies that we looked at found that in terms of volume purchase, the top 5% reduced by nearly 15%, whilst there was absolutely no change in the lowest 70% of purchasing. And again, same sort of products that were coming through with the greatest reductions in terms of cider and spirits. There's a bit of a mix in terms of the qualitative evidence. So there was sort of some varied impacts in terms of the quantity or types of alcohol consumed. So some people sort of saying they did reduce, some people saying they didn't, and some people just saying that they stayed the same. There was also sort of, we identified that there was sort of a limited impact of the policy overall in terms of those with probable alcohol dependence. So finally on to the kind of impact on health, which is the sort of end point of this chain of events. So from one study looking at the impact on alcohol attributable deaths and hospital admissions, we found that there was a reduction in deaths by around 13.4% and of hospital admissions by just over 4%. Reductions were mostly amongst the chronic conditions, so things like alcoholic liver disease, which would typically, that would be experienced by people who are drinking at harmful levels. And there was also driven by the reductions amongst men and those living in the most deprived 40% deciles, so as measured by SIMD. And we can see that here, if we just have a quick look at some of this data, we can see, the effects are all reductions in those 4 deciles, and then when we look at 5 to 10, really very little impact there. We included 5 other sort of quantitative studies that looked at different outcomes in relation to health, and they reported no particular impacts, either positive or negative, across these different outcome areas. And then a range of different sort of findings from the qualitative studies that we included. So there was some evidence of increased withdrawal amongst homeless and street drinkers, potential for increased consumption of either spirits or switching to spirits, which was perceived to result in some potential increase to health harms. Some people reported that they were actually seeking out treatment as a result of a reduction in affordability. And amongst sort of our younger cohort, there was no change in sort of self-reported alcohol-related health harm. So some of the other findings, so relating to this section in purple at the bottom, so we looked at things like the impact on the alcohol industry, and that was an important part of the legislation, was to look at that. But we also looked at sort of the impact on some unintended consequences, such as things like displacement of spending or potential to substitute to other substances. So at a population level, so this is from some of the quantitative data that we had, no evidence of an increase in illicit drug use or switching to drugs from alcohol, or using other sort of alcoholic substances, so non-beverage alcohol or illicit alcohol. No particular change in crime in either direction. No particular change in household food expenditure or the nutritional quality of food, although there was the one kind of finding that was sort of significant was a reduction in sugar intake, and that was specifically through sugar from alcohol. There was some increase in expenditure on alcohol for those households that were purchasing at the most, the greatest volume, but not for those that were purchasing lower amounts. And some inconsistent evidence of the impact on road traffic accidents. And by inconsistent, I think, if I recall correctly, there were 3 studies. One reported that there was an increase, one reported that there was a decrease, and one reported that there was no change. In terms of some of that individual level qualitative evidence, we did see some evidence of increased drug use amongst those who already used drugs, and particularly if they were drinking at harmful levels already as well. And for those with alcohol dependence, there was some evidence of increased financial pressure and having to sort of use strategies to sort of mitigate against that, such as reducing spend on food. In terms of the alcoholic drinks industry, no consistent evidence either positive or negative on these 5 key metrics. I'm not going to go into those because I'm not an economist. Overall, though, off-trade sale value did increase. So the value of revenue that came from that was through the increase in retail prices, and that somewhat offset the reduced volume sales that we saw across those different products. So just to kind of sum up then, overall, at a population level, I think MUP is effective. We've seen reduced consumption as measured by sales. We've seen the greatest reductions being amongst those households that purchase the most. We've seen a reduction in alcohol attributable deaths, a reduction in alcohol attributable admissions, and also has had a positive impact on alcohol-related health inequalities. But it's not necessarily the be-all and end-all of alcohol policy. We do see that there is limited impact on consumption in those with alcohol dependence, and some exacerbation of existing behaviours amongst that group. So I will end there. I have completely forgotten to thank or acknowledge various people, but obviously I didn't do this all on my own. There were a lot of people that contributed to this, so thank you to all of those, and some who are here today as well.